Hello, I'm Dr. Marty Ross. I want to talk to you today about how to diagnose Lyme disease. And my talk is called Overcoming Obstacles, How and Where to Get Diagnosed with Lyme. I am doing this for my online Lyme disease information site at treatlyme.net. And I am a practicing physician, a Lyme literate medical doctor at the Healing Arts Partnership in Seattle, Washington. So the first thing we need to look at is, could it be Lyme? And when I'm considering if somebody might have Lyme disease, what any physician should consider is there a risk of getting it? Are there enough symptoms that look like it? We need to consider, are there other conditions that look like it? And these are conditions that involve excess cytokines. I'll describe more what I mean about that here in a second. Are there any physical findings that suggest Lyme? And then finally, is there a supportive test? Now, I want to be clear about one thing. A test does not diagnose Lyme disease. And in fact, you can have Lyme and testing will miss it. So 80% of the time that we have somebody that I diagnose somebody with Lyme, they may have a positive test, but 20% of the time they don't. And also, testing that says you can have Lyme can be wrong. So sometimes you can have a positive Lyme test, but you have no symptoms of Lyme disease, and there's a good chance that might be a false positive test, okay? So we don't treat just based on the test. And again, it's possible to have Lyme and have a negative test, okay? So the first thing I always consider, and in fact, this is the point I was just making, 20% of people diagnosed with Lyme disease have negative testing. So Lyme is always a clinical diagnosis, okay? All right, so what do I consider? Well, I look initially to see, does a person have enough symptoms that suggest that they might have Lyme, okay? And so to do that, you could do this on your own. You could take a look at the Horowitz Lyme MSIDS questionnaire that I'm showing here. This was developed by Lyme literate medical doctor, Dr. Horowitz, and he's found it to be a useful indicator if you might have Lyme. So I'm just going to flip through this really quickly here. It basically breaks your symptoms down, looks at what your risk factors are. And if you wind up, the last page here is a scoring system. And on this questionnaire, if you score 46 or more, there's a high probability that you can have Lyme disease, okay? Now, in terms of symptoms, the big thing I want to let you know is they generally fall into a few areas. Number one, a lot of people with Lyme can't get sleep. They often will have cognitive dysfunction, meaning they can't think. They'll have fatigue and they'll have body pain. And sometimes they'll have a neurologic symptoms of either numbness or nerve pain. Nerve pain would have qualities of sharp, stabbing, shooting, burning, piercing, or electrical, okay? And so what's interesting is Horowitz, in looking at his questionnaire, has been doing research to say, is it accurate at finding if somebody has Lyme? And one of the key things that he's been finding recently in his studies, trying to validate his questionnaire and the scoring system that he has, is that if somebody has wandering symptoms of wandering neurologic symptoms or wandering pain symptoms, where, for instance, your one joint hurts one day, the next day the other joint hurts, that's something very peculiar to Lyme. That nature of wandering symptoms is very peculiar to Lyme, okay? So one of the things we always consider is, do you have enough symptoms that look like Lyme? One way that you can do this on your own is take a look at the Horowitz questionnaire. You could Google this and find a copy that you could download and fill out on your own, okay? All right. Second thing I consider is there a risk of getting the infection, all right? And so it's interesting is about 50% of people with Lyme do not remember a tick being attached, nor do they remember the classic bullseye rash that many of you may have read about, all right? So some people with Lyme, when they get it, when a tick is attached, they'll get a rash that literally looks like a bullseye. But that only occurs about 50% of the time. In fact, there's other rashes that might show up that are not bullseye rashes. But rashes, a bullseye rash only shows up 50% of the time. And again, 50% of the time, people do not remember a tick bite. So we have to consider, is there still a risk of having run into a tick that you may not be aware of, all right? So for instance, do you live in an area with a lot of Lyme, like the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, or Minnesota? Do you live out in the New England states? Are you in Northern California? These are areas that are thought to have a lot of Lyme, all right? Now, Lyme is everywhere though, okay? So just if you don't live in those areas doesn't mean you can't have Lyme. It just means you have a higher probability if you have a lot of symptoms that look like Lyme of having gotten Lyme then too, all right? We consider, do you have a tick bite? Consider, do you do activities that might have put you near ticks, like hunting, camping, hiking? Also consider, does your sexual partner have Lyme, or have you had sexual partners that might have Lyme? Now, I will tell you this: the science around sexual transmission is a little sketchy. In fact, there is not science that proves sexual transmission, but it is still something that we consider. I think that around 15% of the time, I see that sexual partners have it in my practice. So I think there probably is a possibility, but I think it's a small possibility. Consider if you have family members that have Lyme, all right? That doesn't mean you get it from the family members. The reason I put that factor in here is that there are certain genetic profiles in families where genetically immune systems are set up in a certain way that if somebody gets exposed to Lyme, has a Lyme infection, they will then go on to develop Lyme disease. All right, so let me explain what I mean by that. So you can have a Lyme infection in you that doesn't cause you any problems. That's not Lyme disease. Lyme disease is the mess that develops when you have a germ in you, the Lyme germ, that leads to a bunch of problems, okay? All right, so it is possible that some of us have immune systems that wipe the germ out or keep it under control. But there are certain families where you see a number of members of that family have it, and probably what's going on is due to genetics, their immune systems don't work as well as others might, and maybe they have impaired detoxing mechanisms so that they tend to get sicker more easily as well too, all right? I also consider, is it possible that a person's mother might have had Lyme? We see there is good data kept from a pregnancy registry kept out of the East Coast in the late 80s, early 90s that showed that there is a possibility of a 50% transmission rate of Lyme during pregnancy from a mother that has it to the baby if she was not on an antibiotic that protects against Lyme during pregnancy. All right, so we have to consider that. The other thing I consider is, did you get it from another vector? So, 50% of the time people don't remember having a tick bite. You got to ask the question, is there something else transmitting it? All right. So there's some European studies that show that flies, mosquitoes, mites, and fleas can carry. Carrying doesn't prove they transmit, but there is the possibility if these other vectors carry it, maybe they are transmitting it, okay? So I consider, was there a bunch of bug bites of any kind before the person got sick, okay? All right. And again, as I said, I consider, do you have symptoms of Lyme? And I like looking at the symptom list of the Horowitz questionnaire. But keep in mind, you can have a lot of symptoms that look like Lyme, but it's possible those symptoms are actually due to a group of elevated chemicals that we get in Lyme disease called cytokines. And if you have other conditions in you that trigger cytokines, it can look like Lyme too. Okay, so what are these cytokines? Well, cytokines are chemicals made by white blood cells when you get an infection. And the white blood cells will see an infection or a toxin, and they'll release cytokines to cause more white blood cells to be made, draw those white blood cells to the infection and help them work better, or to the toxin and help them work better, all right? Now, that's all great. However, one of the things that can happen in Lyme and some of these other conditions that trigger cytokines is the immune system doesn't do a good job, and eventually it just keeps creating more and more cytokines, trying harder and harder. And eventually too many cytokines give you all those symptoms that we call Lyme. Most symptoms of Lyme are actually excess cytokine symptoms, okay? So we have to think, and then also these cytokines in excess have another problem. They suppress the immune system. All right, so they're supposed to turn the immune system on, but when they're made in excess, they actually suppress the immune system, all right? So Lyme symptoms are really excess cytokine symptoms. Well, there's other syndromes that produce excess cytokines. One of those is having too many mold toxins in you. And according to work of Dr. Richie Shoemaker out in the Chesapeake area, around 20-25% of all people, when we breathe in, eat in, drink in mold toxins, cannot get them out of our bodies, which triggers too many cytokines, all right? So you got to think about, did I live in a moldy house at one time? Have I been exposed to mold? Did I move into a house and suddenly got sick and I stayed sick after I left that house? Okay. Other conditions that I consider is, does somebody have too many yeast in their intestines? People that might have too many yeast are people that had a lot of antibiotics growing up, women on birth control pills. Those are some things that make you think maybe too many yeast. Too many yeast in the intestines trigger cytokines. So do you have a lot of sugar cravings? Are you gassy or bloated? If you're a woman, do you have a lot of vaginal itching or discharge? Do you have too much acne? Acne is a sign of having too many yeast in the intestines too, okay? Do you have intestinal parasites? Are you a person that's traveled a lot to areas where you might have been exposed to parasites, like in undeveloped areas? Or did you drink a bunch of well water growing up? Well waters, even though they're tested, may have intestinal parasites in them. And parasites can be hard to see, all right? Is it a person that might have chronic virus infections or other chronic bacterial infections? And finally, chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia can also lead to excess cytokines, all right? So it's an interesting point about chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. I'd just like to point out, in my practice in Seattle, Washington, around in 2004, a patient of mine that had chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia asked if I would test her for Lyme. And at that point, my practice was all a chronic fatigue syndrome fibromyalgia practice, okay? So I tested her and it came back positive. And that caused me to really start thinking about, wow, I wonder if I'm missing Lyme in some of these other patients. So I went and tested all of my patients with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And guess what? I found that 30% of those patients had Lyme disease. 30%. I suspect that if we look out on the east coast of the United States, where there's a lot more Lyme, that's probably even higher, okay? All right. Next thing I consider after looking at whether there's enough symptoms and whether there's risk of getting Lyme, and after I've considered are there other conditions that look like Lyme that I need to rule out, including those excess cytokine syndromes, I'm going to look and do a physical exam. Now I will tell you, mostly people look well. The biggest finding I'm going to see on a physical exam, person looks tired. I also may see sometimes that they get confused easily. But generally, there are not many good physical findings that say Lyme disease, okay? All right. Then finally, I'm going to do a test. All right. Now, testing is only another clue we use in trying to determine if somebody has Lyme, okay? And the one thing I want to make sure that if you're going to do testing, make sure you use a lab, especially if it's an independent lab, that has gone out and validated their test, that has actually found known people with Lyme disease that they can prove has Lyme, and then seen if their test can accurately find those patients that have Lyme, all right? And that's an important point I'll raise in a minute when I talk about one lab that's become popular out there that I just don't agree with, all right? In terms of Lyme testing, the most popular test that is used for finding Lyme is the Western blot test, and I would point that out because it's often accepted by insurance. Generally, I don't suggest doing co-infection testing because I find it very unreliable. Yep. And then finally, 20% of people with Lyme do not have a positive test, and you have to diagnose it based on clinical grounds, okay? Like, were they exposed? Do they have enough symptoms that look like Lyme? Have you considered and ruled out all the other things that it could be? And then you might consider if it's Lyme. Okay, so 20% of the time people don't have a positive test, all right? All right. So the standard way of testing Lyme that most of your primary care doctors will do, infectious disease doctors, they're going to follow a method that's called the two-step test that is recommended by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and the Infectious Disease Society of America. This is the test kit that will be done if you go to LabCorp or PAML or PacLab, okay? First step is to do something called an ELISA. Second step is, if that test is positive, is to go ahead and follow it with something called a Western blot, okay? Generally, I think the whole, this test kit that are done in these labs, which is an FDA-approved test kit, is worthless, and I generally would not recommend wasting your money, all right? But let's talk about the two components. So first of all, step one of that two-step test is to do an ELISA or to do something called an IFA. These are could tests. They look to see, has your immune system made antibodies that could attach to a germ, all right? So antibodies are proteins made by white blood cells that can attach to germs, and they act like a big signaling system telling other parts of the immune system, hey, I got a germ, come and get it, all right? The ELISA is a could test. It says you could have antibodies in you that made against Lyme. The trouble is it will only find Lyme 50% of the time. It's a horrible test. I don't even know why they bother even recommending that test anymore. All right. The next test, especially if you have a positive ELISA test, we're supposed to do is a Western blot. And I still think this is one of the best tests, okay? So what we're doing with the Western blot is we grow Lyme germs in a lab, and we kill them, and then we take their proteins, all of the proteins from that germ, and we distribute them in a test strip by running electricity through the test strip after we paste the proteins on that test strip, okay? And what that does is that makes it so that all the proteins that weigh the same amount fall out in a band on that test strip. So many of you, when you've read about Western blot testing, you've seen the word bands. What bands means is all the proteins that weigh the same amount fall out at the same position, okay? All right. All right, so we're looking to see, do you have antibodies that attach to certain proteins on the Lyme germ, all right? So Western blot, if we do it using the CDC FDA-approved method, we'll find it if you have Lyme about 50 to 55% of the time. There's other labs that do a better job of doing a Western blot, like IGeneX and Stony Brook. The State University of Stony Brook has a Lyme lab. Their way of doing a Western blot will find Lyme if you have it about 70 to 75% of the time. So it's a better test, much better than that ELISA is, okay? All right. Now, why is it that the Stony Brook or IGeneX method may be better? Well, one is that those labs look to see if you have antibodies against more proteins than what the FDA-approved test kit does, all right? So you have a bigger fingerprint, all right? Secondly, especially with IGeneX grows two strains of Lyme, the original East Coast strain and another strain, all right? Versus the FDA-approved test kit only uses one strain. So we may be missing because we're testing against the wrong germ. All right. So if you're going to do a Western blot, either do it through the SUNY Stony Brook lab or through IGeneX. All right. Okay. So first, some more points about Western blot. First of all, most physicians don't know how to interpret. And even if IGeneX returns a test and says it's indeterminate or negative, if you know how to interpret it, it might be positive. All right. So let's talk about how to interpret these. All right. So when we're doing a Western blot, we're looking to see if we have antibodies against two families. There's a family called IgM antibodies and another family called IgG antibodies, all right? And when you get a report back, it's for both families of antibodies. And what we're looking to see when IGeneX does it and when SUNY Stony Brook does it is we're looking to see, do you have antibodies for these two families against 12 proteins? And of those 12 proteins, there's 6 that are really important. And they're the proteins that are found at band 2325, 31, 34, 39, 41, and 8393. And what those numbers are, those are the weights of what the proteins weigh. Okay? All right. And the standard that we use is that you need to have antibodies against at least 2 of those 6 proteins. All right. All right. So, and that's what both SUNY Stony Brook will do it that way too. Okay. Now, one point I want to make about these antibodies, the first family of antibodies we make when we get sick is IgM. And then they're supposed to go away and get replaced by IgG. That's what happens in all infections. All right. Once you develop IgG, they stay there. They're the memory of the immune system. They don't go away. IgMs are supposed to go away. In fact, they're supposed to go away by around 6 weeks to 3 months. But in Lyme disease, that doesn't happen. In fact, 80% of the time that somebody has a positive Western blot in Lyme, it's the IgMs. And so there's a number of theories about why people don't progress from IgMs to IgGs, but the reality is this is what happens about 80% of the time. And so one of the things that, in terms of overcoming obstacles, is don't get confused by having an IgM. Many doctors will look at a positive IgM and say it's a false positive because you've been sick more than 6 weeks to 3 months. And that's not true. IgMs in Lyme tend not to go away, and they're there about 80% of the time, even after somebody has had Lyme for a long time. Okay? All right. One of the things you can do if you get a Lyme test back that's kind of indeterminate, it's not necessarily positive. You've got antibodies maybe against one of the 6 proteins that I identified earlier, but the lab is reporting that it's an indeterminate finding at 31 or 34, for instance. One of the things you can do, and what that indeterminate means when you see an indeterminate showing up at one of these band or protein positions, is it's either dirt showing up on the test strip, or you're making antibodies, but you're making such a small amount of them that they can't be really measured that well, okay? So one of the things you can do to get a stronger Lyme test on a Western blot is to use antibiotics for 3 weeks and then redo the test. And the idea behind that is that it overcomes 2 obstacles, okay? One is when you have Lyme, due to immune suppression, it may be hard for the immune system to make the antibodies. The second obstacle that we have to getting a positive Western blot is that Lyme doesn't like to live in the blood. Oxygen in the blood kills Lyme. Lyme's designed to survive, and so it will move into tissues far out of the way of oxygen where the immune system can't see it, okay? So when you use antibiotics for 3 weeks, you may be lowering some of the immune suppression by killing some of the Lyme germs. But secondly, when you kill these germs that are living in tissues, tissues don't like to hold on to dead bug parts. They release those Lyme proteins into the bloodstream where, guess what? The immune system can see it and it can have a stronger reaction, okay? So when I do an antibiotic challenge test, I'm looking to see, does the test become more positive? I'm also looking to see, do you get better? Or do you have something that looks like a Herxheimer reaction, which is you make more cytokines from killing Lyme germs, so do your Lyme symptoms get worse, okay? Those are the 2 things I consider in an antibiotic challenge, all right? So, all right, so 2 obstacles to consider about a Western blot is, first of all, IgMs are not false positives, they're real. Second obstacle is what to do when you have an indeterminate test, and that is you want to do this antibiotic challenge then, okay? All right, now, one other thing about Western blots that is a problem is that, which is overcome by a new Lyme test, which is called the immunoblot, which uses synthetic proteins, is that sometimes the proteins found at position 31, 41, and 93 on the Western blot technique will attract antibodies against germs that are not Lyme. So sometimes when you do the Western blot and there's antibodies stuck on 31, 41, or 93, those are actually antibodies that were made against another infection, okay? So to overcome that, there is a new test technique that has come out that IGeneX just recently introduced, which is called an immunoblot, which uses synthetic proteins. And what we've done is we grow the proteins in the lab. We don't distribute them into a test strip anymore because we don't have to separate them. So we can grow a test tube that has the 8393 protein. We can grow a test tube that has the band 31 protein, okay? And then we can look to see, do you have antibodies against those specific proteins? And for band 31, 41, and 93 on the immunoblot, we use cleaned up versions of the 31, 41, and 93 protein that are designed not to attract antibodies from other infections, okay? So this immunoblot that IGeneX just introduced, I think is actually probably a better test. And it finds Lyme about 91% of the time when Lyme is there, all right? So better than the Western blot, all right? Now, one reason it may be better than the Western blot is that IGeneX is also looking to see with this new immunoblot using synthetic proteins, they're looking to see, do you have antibodies against 8 strains of the Lyme germ, okay? Some of those are actually European strains as well, too. So this might do a better job finding European Lyme, all right? And so this is becoming my new favorite Lyme test because it will find Lyme if you have it 91% of the time. And it tends to have less false positives than the Western blot because it's using these cleaned up versions of protein 31, 41, and 93. All right, another test that you can do is to get a Lyme DNA test using a technique called a PCR. The trouble, as I described earlier, is that Lyme doesn't like to live in the blood. And this is a DNA test for Lyme in the blood. All right, so this test only finds Lyme if it's present about 31% of the time, or 30 to 31% of the time. All right. And then there's this newer lab that's done a great job of marketing its services to naturopathic doctors and integrative medicine doctors called DNA Connections. I'm not using it, and I would urge you to stay away from this lab. They haven't done the validation studies that I mentioned earlier. In other words, they've never gone out to see does their test accurately diagnose the things that they say it does. And where this became an issue for me is that I get referrals in my practice from people from all over the Pacific Northwest that have been seen by naturopaths or other integrated medicine doctors, and they want my opinion. And many of these people will come in with their DNA Connections test, and it will say that they have Bartonella or say they have Babesia, but when I start asking them about the symptoms suggesting those illnesses, they don't have it. So I think this lab is overdiagnosing at least those co-infections. I don't know if it's overdiagnosing Lyme or not, but because they haven't done the basic validation studies, I would urge people to stay away from this lab system. Okay, another test that you can do for Lyme is something called an ELISpot. An ELISpot is a method that we use to see, do your white blood cells, a type of white blood cells called T cells, react when Lyme proteins are shown to them. All right, it's another immune system test, okay? And there are a number of labs that are doing this. This test, according to studies, can find Lyme if you have it about 85% of the time. So we take your T cells, we introduce them to Lyme proteins, and we look to see, do they release certain cytokines, all right? I mentioned cytokines earlier, all right? All right, so in the States, a lab called Pharmacin used to do it. They just lost their accreditation. IGeneX is starting to do one recently as of the end of 2017. However, their internal validation studies show that it will only find Lyme about 35% of the time. So I'm tending to stay away from the IGeneX test for right now until they correct whatever problems they're having or do a better validation study to say that it works. Again, Armin Labs in Germany thinks that it's finding about 85% of the time. And so I consider doing this if an immunoblot or Western blot is negative, and I still think that somebody has a high probability of having Lyme. All right, and then finally there's the Lyme disease blood culture that came out a number of years ago. It's offered by a lab called Advanced Laboratory Services. They've done studies, validation studies, on about 45 people, I think, that show that this test can find Lyme if present about 95% of the time. I think that in the real world, though, as we use this test, I don't think it can be as high as 95%. And that is because, as I mentioned earlier, Lyme doesn't live in the blood. So it's hard for me to see that this test technique can find Lyme 95% of the time. It's also a costly test. It costs about $595, all right? So what is my testing strategy? All right, so first of all, if you call up IGeneX and they tell you to do the whole Lyme disease panel, which includes PCR, ELISA, or IFA, Western blot, immunoblot, refuse it. Don't do all those tests. You don't need to do it. You either need to do the Western blot, which is test 188 and 189 only, or get the immunoblot, IgG and IgM, which is a $450 test. Either one of those. If you can afford the immunoblot, their new immunoblot, I would do that. That's the $450 test. But keep in mind, it's not clear if insurance is going to recognize that test versus there's a better track record of insurance recognizing the validity of a Western blot and even other doctors recognizing the validity of the Western blot, okay? So I'm either going to do the immunoblot or the Western blot. I don't advise doing co-infection testing. I think it's a waste. I think that people should determine clinically whether there is a Babesia, Bartonella, Ehrlichia, or Anaplasma infection there. If the Western blot or immunoblot is negative, the next step would be to do an ELISpot. And what I like doing for ELISpot testing is probably using Armin Labs. I don't think that IGeneX has perfected their test well enough at this point. And then another thing you could do if you absolutely need a confirmatory test is consider that Lyme disease blood culture. Again, it's a little costly at $595, okay? Now, one other point I want to make about testing. One big obstacle is getting your doctor to do the right test, okay? So one way you can do that is to literally bring in the test kit that you want to have done. So you can call up IGeneX, for instance, and have them send you the test kit. and circle which test you want to have done. So either the Western blot, test 188 or 189, or circle the immunoblot, IgG and IgM. And I forgot to write down those numbers here, but just circle it and then take it to your doctor and say, sign off on this test. This is the Lyme test that I want to have done. It's more accurate. You can even show them the numbers that I just was talking to you about here earlier. Okay? All right. The validation numbers, I should say, or the accuracy numbers. Okay? All right. So finally, one other way to overcome an obstacle finding a Lyme disease diagnosis is to find somebody that's friendly to the diagnosis to help you make the diagnosis. All right. So how do you do that? Well, one is you can go to the International Lyme Associated Diseases Society website. That's called iLabs, and that's ilads.org. On their Contact Us page, you can communicate with them about where you live and where you would like to find a Lyme doctor, okay? Another group that's open to considering Lyme disease diagnosis, that has a sense of how to work with some of this, is our doctors that are part of a group called the Institute for Functional Medicine, and they're at functionalmedicine.org, and you look under their Doctor Finder section. And then finally, naturopathic physicians generally are open to the idea of considering if you might have Lyme and know how to work with these tests. And they can be found through naturopathic.org. Okay? All right. So thank you for participating in this seminar about how to diagnose a Lyme disease. I hope you found it helpful. The one thing you may want to consider if you have more questions about what to do with Lyme disease, take a look at the rest of the articles found within the Treat Lyme book, of which this is part of one of those articles. The Treat Lyme book is found at treatlyme.net. It's a whole resource that I have put together for people with Lyme disease. You'll find many helpful articles that help you deal with all aspects of the illness, okay? This is just one of those articles. So go to treatlyme.net to look at that comprehensive body of work. And good luck to you with your efforts to get a Lyme disease diagnosis and to get Lyme disease treatment.